So what I'm going to talk about today is what I call global epistemic justice, and you'll see at the top that's my email address. And in case you want to contact me, I'm in the sociology department, not very far from here. You can just email me if you have any questions, and if you want any readings related to what I'm talking about today, feel free to contact me. As was pointed out in the introduction, right, I'm the founder of this field known as social epistemology. And social epistemology is simply another way of saying the social foundations of knowledge. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that deals with knowledge. And historically, within Western philosophy certainly, knowledge has been seen as kind of something that individuals do. And it's only, you might say, it's taken a while for the idea that knowledge is an inherently social activity, an inherently social product, right? Something that's embedded in society in a more general kind of way. In a sense, these are kind of more modern developments within the field of epistemology. And I've been very much in the forefront of discussing these matters. Of course, in the history of Western philosophy, you can find precedents for the kinds of things that I'll be talking about. But in a sense, this is a discussion that is very much with us now, okay? Now, global epistemic justice is basically about how what people know gets heard to a larger audience. In a sense, that's kind of what it's about, right? So you operate on the assumption that people in different parts of the world, not only in different disciplines, but in different parts of the world, pursue knowledge differently. And they pursue knowledge differently for lots of reasons. First of all, they have different reasons for wanting knowledge, right? So the kind of knowledge that people find as valuable differs across the world. And also the kinds of methods and theories that people work with when they're producing knowledge also can be very different. And as we know, just looking at the Western Academy alone, right? You look at a Western university, and you look at the range of disciplines, right? And we can, in a way, kind of array them over many dimensions. Where, let's say, there's a difference between qualitative and quantitative, right? Abstract and concrete, right? And you could think about, the pursuit of knowledge along all these different dimensions, even within any Western university. And so this issue, in a sense, gets kind of magnified when we're talking about, right, all the different countries in the world, all the different, cultures, and all that kind of stuff. And so there is this issue of global epistemic justice, right? So if you operate under the assumption that people are producing knowledge under very many different circumstances with very different motivations, right? But nevertheless, they are part of, some kind of common reality, common earth, right? That there's a sense in which all of this difference is happening in a space that we all share. And this is what makes the thing interesting and difficult. Because as you know, probably if you know anything about the history of knowledge, if you look at it as a kind of global phenomenon, it's certainly true that if we start, let's say, in the late 18th century, early 19th century, that there is quite clear Western dominance around the world. Western kinds of ways of thinking, Western, forms of philosophy, science, and so forth, are clearly dominant. Of course, there are others, but we would talk about this period of the last, let's say, 250 years as being Western dominated. And there's a sense in which the extent to which other forms of knowledge, other voices, get heard and taken seriously have had to do with the degree to which they can actually be channeled into or translated into this kind of larger Western discourse. I think you're all familiar with this phenomenon. Nowadays we like to talk politely about globalization as having something to do with this, but back in the old days we used to talk about imperialism. And they're pretty much the same thing in a way. And so the problem of global epistemic justice is basically the problem of what's the right way to organize all these voices, right? All these different types of people from different cultures who are pursuing knowledge, right? How do we come up with a just way so that we're taking everybody sufficiently seriously? Right? Because the problem of global epistemic justice arises, just like any other problem of justice, because there's injustice. Right? We wouldn't be talking about this if everything was perfect. And so the issue of injustice comes in as a kind of a baseline fact, you might say, of the situation, right? Which is to say that not all cultures are taken equally seriously, not all forms of knowledge are taken equally seriously, regardless of how many people are practicing them, right? Regardless of how their impacts are kind of judged by the people who practice them, right? So the point is that there is injustice in that sense, at a kind of factual level, you might say, right? And then the question becomes, well, there are two questions. One question, obviously, is how you redress the injustice, right? In other words, yes, we recognize this is unjust, but what do we do? And then the other is are there principles of justice generally, so that you can determine whether someone has been listened to properly, whether someone's, arguments have been taken seriously. Is there a standard for that? Okay. Now, there are no easy answers to these questions. And in a sense, the second question, the one that in a sense is more theoretical, is kind of the more important question from a kind of long-term global governance standpoint. In other words, what does it mean at a global level to take forms of knowledge seriously? And how can you tell whether or not they are being taken seriously? Right? Because here's the problem. When we're talking about knowledge, not only are we talking about forms of cultural or disciplinary expression, we're certainly talking about that, right? Different ways in which people see the world, different ways in which disciplines see the world. We're certainly talking about that. But at the same time, when we're talking about knowledge, we're also talking about something that at the end of the day is fallible. That is to say, it can be wrong. Right? And because very much part of what it means to produce knowledge, right, is that you correct error, right? And you try to get closer to whatever, reality, the truth. We're not going to have a big discussion about that issue, but obviously that is the issue in the background, right? That there's a sense in which when we're talking about knowledge, right, the knowledge is about reality, right? And to have really good knowledge, it has to be true. But of course, as we're pursuing knowledge, we are constantly making mistakes, right? And it doesn't have to do with the fact that anyone's necessarily lying or covering up stuff, though that does happen a lot. But that's not the only reason. It's just part of the knowledge process itself, because we're human beings, makes it fallible. So in a sense, it's not just that you have to recognize the voices and the different perspectives, but there also has to be a way to say, look, guy, you're wrong. Right? So you have to do both. You have to recognize, but you also have to be able to criticize. Okay? And this is kind of epistemology as a field in philosophy about the nature of knowledge is very much about that. Right? It's about basically figuring out, okay, who is saying something that we should listen to, and then how do we determine whether what they say is true or false so that, we can go forward together. And so ultimately, any kind of theory of epistemic justice, especially at a global level, will have to deal with both of these things, right? They'll have to deal with that. And once again, I'm not going to be able to solve this problem for you, though I do think that, if you look at theories of justice in general, so within political philosophy and legal philosophy, my own PhD actually was a kind of a comparison of scientific and legal decision-making. And at this university, as I have now, not only here, but in the previous universities in which I've worked, I've very often have been teaching law students, okay? And I do think that the philosophy of law, legal theory, theories of justice, actually do provide a kind of model or template for thinking about this specific issue of epistemic justice, okay? And so I just put that on the table. I don't know, we can get into more detail in the questions if you're interested in talking about this more, but I'm just sort of saying, in a sense, this is kind of where the conversation goes. Now, so let's think about where we are at the moment, and how would we want to launch a sort of theory of global epistemic justice. Now, one of the things that I mentioned when I was in China, and it kind of came up in the introduction, was the use of English. Okay, And I want to say something about that because I actually think that's kind of an important thing to sort of think about for a moment, okay? Um, so the English language. Um, Now, of course, the English language is something that originates in this part of the world. But one of the distinctive features about the English language, among other, if you're comparing it to the other languages of the world, is the proportion of non-native to native speakers. 5 to 1. There's no other language that even comes close. That's an important point. Because when we think about English as the global language, even though obviously English is not the language with the most native speakers, what we mean is this. We mean the fact that the non-natives, right, there's 5 to 1 ratio of non-native to native, okay? Now that's quite important because what that does is, if you want to think about global epistemic justice as involving, among other things, a kind of common standard of communication, right? As it were, a common channel in which we can transact our knowledge claims that people can understand regardless of where they come from, English is by far the closest thing to it. There is nothing closer, okay? And so this business about, all these Chinese publications and they're doing so well and so forth, very smart, right? This, I would say, if you want to talk about a single practical strategy for having the Chinese voice being, heard in the global conversation, do it in English. And by the way, historically, to give you a sense of, because I think maybe the comparison, so let's say Mandarin Chinese, the ratio of non-native to native speakers is 1 to 40. Okay? Even if we look at languages like Spanish, which is a kind of a fairly global European language, right? The ratio is 1 to 5. Not 5 to 1, as in the case of English. And in the case of Arabic and Russian, which are languages that have had kind of imperial expanse, you might say, it's 1 to 2. Right? So in other words, in all these cases, the natives outnumber the non-natives. Okay? Except in English. Right? And this is quite an important feature. And of course, there are all kinds of reasons for this. Right? Of course, there's all kinds of reasons for this. I would say that we could talk about, British imperialism and then sort of, you might say, the handover in the 20th century from Britain to the United States, right? I mean, the history is pretty transparent about how that happened. But one thing I think that is quite interesting, kind of at a more technological infrastructure level, is that starting with the telegraph. So the telegraph, in a way, was the first global communications channel in the 19th century, English. There was a French version, but that disappeared. And then if you look at the typewriter, right, it was English originally. All of the major technological innovations that have been important in communications have been coded in English initially. And then other languages come in kind of in a way to assert themselves against the backdrop where English is considered default. Okay? That's an important part too, especially given that, in a sense, if you control the medium, you control the message. Right? So the importance of English in this context is very important. I would say, just as a kind of a interesting sidelight that sort of in a way puts this in a little more nuance, is of course that when you get into social media and you're no longer just talking about text-based, but you're also talking about, visuals and sound and stuff like that, right? Then it becomes kind of easier, right, for people who aren't so hot in English, right, to actually be able to communicate quite effectively. And of course, when you're looking at most social media, there's a premium placed on the communication being relatively short or brief. So in other words, you don't have to write elaborate sentences and big paragraphs to show how wonderful you know the English language, right? You could just say a few short, sharp things, like in a commercial or an advertisement, something in that style, and you can have a lot of impact. And so that, in a way, you might say, has been breaking apart this general trajectory. But I think for purposes of academic knowledge production and other kind of authoritative knowledge production, English is still, as we say, the lingua franca, right? And And so that's an important thing, that the more and more that there are non-native speakers of English, right, that are in the literature, that are visible, that has a big effect. And in fact, one of the consequences of it is it's actually kind of altered some of the stylistic conventions in scientific journal writing. Okay, so in other words, you don't have you don't have to write literary English for academic articles, right? You don't have to have good style, as we would say, because when you're an native English speaker and you've been properly trained, as it were, right? You often read a lot of literature and good writing, right? And you're supposed to in some way emulate the style or see it as some kind of model. Well, that doesn't apply in academic writing, right? I mean, you just have to get the point across, right? And of course, academic writing, as you know nowadays, is indistinguishable from, let's say, ChatGPT, right? The stylistic quality of it is no different. Now, you see, our acceptance of that very much has to do with the fact that the majority of people who are writing academic English are non-native, right? So we know, you could be considered a perfectly acceptable writer or speaker of English without having had any course in English literature, right? You don't have to know anything, right? You just have to know the grammar, right? You have to know how the words, right? In other words, you just need to know what ChatGPT knows, and away you go, right? And you could win the Nobel Prize next week. Who knows, right? And so this is kind of an interest. So this is a very important kind of, you might say, first step to establishing a standard of global epistemic justice. Namely, English is a kind of level playing field in which people can kind of make their claims felt. Okay, so that's one thing. Now, I want to talk about something a little more subtle as well. And again, I think you'll kind of get into it the more that we if you're academically minded, let's put it that way. So I'm going to introduce a concept to you. This is a concept that comes from information science, and it's called undiscovered public knowledge. Have any of you heard this phrase? No? Okay. So this phrase is from about 40 years ago, 1980s, and it was coined by an information scientist at the University of Chicago, and the guy's name was Don Swanson, and he's actually a very big figure in the field of information science. And here's what he noticed, and I think this is perfectly obvious to anyone who is involved in the academic enterprise. That yes, we are producing enormous amounts of knowledge in terms of publications and articles and all this kind of stuff, and it's rising exponentially, and the number of people involved is just tremendous, and all of this knowledge is being produced, right? I mean, we could see the curves, how much stuff is being produced. Most of it isn't read, right? And certainly even less of it is cited, okay? And we're talking some pretty significant ratios, right? So 80% of the citations go to 20% of the publications, which suggest, and sometimes people put it this way, 80, only 20% of the stuff is read and 80% is just ignored, right? And the stuff can be ignored in a sense, so, well, why is this going on? Well, of course, the reason why we have this phenomenon, and by the way, this phenomenon is not new. This phenomenon was already being reported in the 1960s. Okay, so the 1960s, we're talking about, this was again for those of you who don't know about the kind of sociology of science. In the 1960s, we started it's basically kind of a Cold War phenomenon. It's called big science. Right? And big science was, I mean, as you may know, the Cold War, especially if we think about the US versus the USSR, right, was very much a war that was conducted primarily through science, right? So who's going to be the first person on the moon, right? And it was also conducted in terms of who was going to be making discoveries and things like this. There was a lot of the effort and a lot of funding was put into it, and it was a golden age for people working in science and academic fields more generally, funded by the state. This was the Cold War, both in the US and the USSR and other countries around the world. A similar kind of thing, this country, most of the European countries, same kind of deal. And so you started to see a massification of publications. As I say, more and more publications happening very quickly, more and more people going to university, studying sciences and affiliated subjects. And in fact, one of the reasons why, for example, molecular biology, computer science, you think about all these fields that are now very much in the vanguard, right, of not only science, but also practical applications, right? They were all seeded. The seed funding for all these fields was in the Cold War, okay? And this was what led to the kind of massification of science. And so even in the 1960s, right? So the 1960s is 60 years ago, right? And big science, this is a term coined by Derek DeSola Price. He is what they call a scientometrician. He measures the size and shape of science. How many articles there are, who cites them, where are they being published, and you get all these nice little scattergrams and, network analysis. You've seen these things, right? Computers can do beautiful things with them these days. Well, he was talking about this in he was a mathematician by training, and he was talking about this, and so he noticed this, right? That in fact, if you look at the citation spread in any given discipline, right, you'll have a few people who get cited all the time, and then the vast majority of people in the field don't get cited at all. And this is common across disciplines. So this is not just something in the natural science. This is true in the social sciences and the humanities as well, okay? Now you think about this for a second, right? You might say, my God, where is DOGE, right? Elon Musk, Department of Government Efficiency, right? It looks like there are a lot of people wasting their time in their lives here because they're doing all this research and publishing all these articles, and nobody's reading them, nobody's citing them. Now, of course, because the reason why people write these articles, right, is not to get cited. They do it to get promoted, right? Because their universities are telling them this is important, right? And so you start saying, hey, Mr. Dean, I have published 5 articles in this top flight journal. Dean's not going to ask you, has anyone read this stuff? No, he's just going to look at, oh, this is a top flight journal, right? And as you know, nowadays, the way in which, when we start talking about the respective significance of journals, we have this thing you may be familiar with, impact factor. Some of you who know something about academic publishing will know about the impact factor. The interesting thing about the impact factor is that the impact factor is a kind of a weighted value, right? That is to say, if you're someone who publishes in a top flight journal, there's a weighting that helps you, even if your article is not published, even if your article is not cited too much. Right? Because the weighting has to do with, so in other words, if there are people who publish in this journal who are themselves cited a lot, then the journal will be regarded as a highly cited journal, and the fact that your article is not cited a lot won't matter too much. You will be carried along. Okay? And so these scientometricians are in fact designing the metrics, right, so that you can look good even if you have no real impact, because you're publishing in a journal with impact, right? And it's so, it's kind of like merit by association. Like, I knew a guy who went to Harvard once. Where's my PhD? It's kind of like that. Okay? Now, but you still have the Elon Musk problem, right? Namely, why are people doing this, right? Is this rational, right? This research is being done and nobody's reading it, nobody's citing it. Right? And so here comes Swanson, okay? So Swanson becomes, the key figure here. So what Swanson makes a couple of observations, which in a way are quite obvious, but somebody had to make them, right? And that is that academic knowledge production, as it stands, is very path dependent. That is to say, depending on who is the school of thought or the research team or whatever who starts a particular line of inquiry, right? They, in a sense, determine the parameters of what follows. And everybody tries to catch up with them and maybe do better than them, but they're playing their game. right? So of course the people who found a field very often do not end up becoming, the greatest beneficiaries of it, but the point is the people who do win by their rules, okay? And Thomas Kuhn, philosopher of science you may have heard of, I've written a lot on this guy, he talks about this as a paradigm, right? That all scientific disciplines have paradigms. And that's to say, there is this moment, as it were, where a kind of research program is crystallized, and the research program, from a historical standpoint, is very often only one of many ways in which the field of study could have been conceptualized. But once it gets conceptualized this way, this one way, then everybody falls into place. The alternatives disappear, right? And what happens to the people is kind of an interesting story as well. But the point is, you end up getting this, tunnel vision, right? That starts to operate in the discipline. And that, in fact, becomes what the discipline regards as progress, right? Because this initial research team, which sets the terms of what it means to do research, basically lays out also what are the problems that this field needs to establish, and what does it count, what counts as a good solution to those problems. They set the terms, and then everybody starts working on the stuff. And progress comes the more and more these problems are solved. And if you know anything about Thomas Kuhn's theory, right, basically this whole way of thinking about science self-destructs after a while, because you can't solve all the problems that you set out to solve in just one way, right? But the point is, while all this is going on, and it's going on in all the different fields of knowledge simultaneously, there are paradigms all over the place, is that most of the stuff that's actually published that doesn't fit into this is ignored, right? And it's ignored at many different levels. It's not just that people, don't read it and don't cite it, but even if you submit an article, let's say, to an academic journal, right, which takes a somewhat unorthodox approach to something, you're going to have a hard time getting published, right? Because even if from a technical standpoint, everything's okay, nevertheless, you will have the peer reviewer say, this article on its own terms is pretty solid, the calculations are good, the reasoning is good, but this is not really what people are working on these days, right? A lot of peer review reports are like that, right? They're like that, right? Where you're rejected because you're not relevant, not because you're wrong, okay? And relevance has to do with being part of this trajectory where all the scientists are going. And so what that often means is that either people who are pursuing unorthodox forms of knowledge don't get published at all, or they get published in lesser journals, right? Because relatively few people just quit at this point. What they do is they end up going to a lower journal in the pecking order, which in a way, yes, it publishes them, but it makes them more obscure, right? People aren't likely to find them so much. Okay, and that is how academic knowledge production works, right? And Swanson, as an information scientist, could see this. You could see this whole thing going on. And so what he basically thought was that one of the things you need to do, and he just did it as an individual, but then later on in his career, because remember, he is initially writing in the 1980s, and even though he has some technical knowledge of computer science, the sort of search and retrieval engines that we associate with Google and other things today were just at their infancy back in the 1980s, right? We didn't get anything of the scale that Google was able to present, which only happened in the late 1990s, okay? But Swanson was saying, well, look, one thing you want to do is you want to read across disciplines. In other words, you want to combine ideas, you want to combine facts in ways that they're not normally combined. So in that sense, you break the path dependency, because the path dependency in academic disciplines is like a kind of narrow mindset, where you only look at certain things and you ignore everything else, right? And the point is, you want to see across. You want to see across the differences. And of course, then you can program machines, and this is something that he increasingly was doing in the 1990s and the early 2000s before he died, was to actually program machines so that, if you have kind of, especially interdisciplinary type problems, right? Problems that aren't their natural home isn't one discipline, but rather it's a kind of a larger kind of problem, right? Actually, something like cancer might be an example, right? The disease cancer, right? I mean, yes, it's medical in a broad kind of sense, but if you think about all the factors that are involved, right, that there's a sense in which if you really want an understanding for how the disease works and how you're going to cure it and everything, you really need to have a lot of disciplines operating with each other. But that means you need to get people incentivized to actually read across the different disciplines to see the possible connections that can be made. Okay, and so Swanson developed some early computer science programs that were able to do that kind of work. And he himself did it, actually. He showed how this could be done. Um, and um, the one reason why I raise this is that one of the ways I think it's very difficult in the current structure of academia, right? This kind of path dependency of research, which is, by the way, reinforced, of course, by the way universities are organized. I haven't said too much about universities, but universities basically reproduce people generation after generation to have this path dependent way of thinking, right? So you are systematically discouraged from reading across fields. Right? Interdisciplinarity is something that you do on the weekends or something, right? It's not something that's considered integral to frontline knowledge production. Universities reinforce this pattern very much. There's no doubt about it. In fact, it kind of gives it even a kind of momentum. However, one of the things, if we're talking about, and the other point I want to make, to go back to the general point about the global epistemic justice, these path dependencies all invariably began at Western universities, right? The fact that disciplines are pursuing things in a certain way they did, I mean, it may have been Britain, it may have been France, it may have been Germany, it may have been the United States, but it's a Western place. You know that much, right? Just about everything begins at a Western university, Western research team, and then spreads outward, and it gets reproduced in other parts of the world. And so and it's going to be very difficult, given the way in which universities are organized, to actually just overthrow this system overnight, okay? However, computer science and search engines can be your friend in this task. Because if you look at something, so let's say ChatGPT, generative artificial intelligence. One of the things that is quite interesting about generative artificial intelligence is that it, generally speaking, does not reflect the biases of the impact factors, right? So ChatGPT and all these generative AI things have in their data banks increasingly large amounts of the academic publications. Right? And I can tell you right now, publishers are actually selling at bargain basement prices their academic publications, much to the distress of authors, by the way. They're just selling this stuff to Sam Altman and all the other kind of generative AI people, so it becomes part of the data bank. Now, the thing is that when generative AI takes all of this stuff, all these academic publications, right, the academic publications don't come along with impact factors written on them. Right? They're just there equal. All the publications are just out there equally, and then it's up to the ChatGPT to figure out how to combine them. And this is one of the reasons why, and I think we're going to see this more and more, generative artificial intelligence is going to come up with some amazing things, right? And one of the reasons why it's going to come up with amazing things, even though it's working on material that was produced by humans, is because it's not going to respect the kind of hierarchies of what is really relevant, what is not relevant that academics establish, right? It's going to have a much more egalitarian approach to all the literature that's out there, and then it's going to work with it that way. And so the results are actually going to be, in many cases, quite destabilizing. At least this is what I predict in the future as this stuff gets better and better, and more of the academic literature is inputted into generative artificial intelligence. And I think in the long term, this will have a very destabilizing effect in terms of making people realize that it is possible to come up with, coherent research programs, coherent arguments in science and so forth that don't require following the established path that was set down by some Western research team, whatever, 50 or 100 years ago. Okay? And so in this respect, I think, one should keep a sharp eye on generative artificial intelligence, and one should, welcome it. And in a sense, try to exploit it as a way of trying to come up with alternative ways of thinking about issues. Okay? And because, of course, all of this AI stuff is increasingly available across the world, right? There's a sense in which the spread of it is very hard to contain. that in fact this will be, I would say, if you want to talk about a kind of grassroots way of destabilizing the kind of knowledge structures dominated by the West that have existed for the last 150 years, it will come through creative uses of generative artificial intelligence, largely processing this literature, right? Largely processing the academic literature in a new way, making new connections between things that the academic establishment itself has been ignoring. But it's there. And that's why it's called undiscovered public knowledge, because the articles are there, right? It's just that nobody's incentivized to read them, but ChatGPT can read them, right? And it can read real fast, and it can mix and match things real fast. And so you can end up seeing these things, right? And I think that's going to be quite powerful in the long term. I'm thinking of wrapping this up now. Shuang, where are we on time? Because I think maybe I've been talking too long. We can open this up.
No, we still got like 20 minutes to share. And then we have a Q&A.
Yeah, because I think I've already put quite a lot on the table here. And so I would be very, because I've just been thinking, oh God, if these people haven't thought about this before, this is quite a lot. But the point is, I am happy to take questions from all of you. There's a lot more that can be said, but I hope there's enough here that we can begin with. Okay? Thank you so much for your attention.